Evelyn Harrow stood at the foot of Ashcroft Manor, the towering estate looming against the darkening sky. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, the autumn wind whispering through the barren trees like a distant voice calling her home. She hadn't been back to the manor since childhood, and now, after the passing of her estranged aunt, it was hers. The letter from the solicitor had been brief, detailing only the inheritance and a key wrapped in brittle parchment. There were no fond memories tied to the place, only half-remembered shadows that haunted her dreams. Evelyn's fingers trembled as she slid the key into the rusted lock. The heavy door groaned open, revealing the dust-laden corridor beyond. Inside, Ashcroft Manor was a mausoleum of faded grandeur. The grand staircase curved into darkness, and the chandeliers hung like skeletal remains of forgotten opulence. Sheets draped over the furniture like ghosts frozen in place, and the oppressive silence weighed on Evelyn's chest. A familiar unease crept up her spine as she wandered through the halls, each creak of the wooden floorboards echoing in the cavernous space. The portrait gallery was unchanged, rows of stern faces watching her every move, their eyes seeming to shift when she wasn't looking. In the library, dust motes swirled in the faint light of a single flickering bulb. As she scanned the spines of old tomes, a cold draft tickled the nape of her neck, and for a brief moment she thought she heard her name whispered in the hush. The first night was restless. Evelyn found herself waking in the early hours, drenched in sweat, her dreams riddled with fleeting images of the manor's past. A child's laughter echoed down the hall, but when she stepped out of her room, there was nothing but shadows, pooling at the end of the corridor. The following days brought stranger occurrences. Objects moved from their places, doors creaked open on their own, and Evelyn began to hear whispers drifting through the walls, soft and pleading, growing louder when she tried to ignore them. The air in the manor felt heavier, pressing down on her thoughts, muddling her sense of time and reality. She discovered an old journal tucked away in a drawer, the handwriting barely legible, chronicling her aunt's descent into madness. The pages spoke of an unseen presence, a force lurking beneath the surface of the manor, waiting, watching. Evelyn dismissed it as hysteria until she saw the figure in the mirror. It happened in the drawing room. Evelyn had been sitting by the fireplace, the warmth doing little to chase away the chill in her bones. When she glanced up at the mirror above the mantel, her reflection wasn't alone. A dark figure stood just behind her, its face obscured by shadow. She spun around, but the room was empty. The whispers grew more persistent, clawing at the edges of her sanity. She began losing track of time, waking in rooms she didn't remember entering, finding cryptic messages scrawled onto the walls in a hand that resembled her own. "Let me in," they read, over and over. Panic clawed at Evelyn's chest. She realized the manor was more than just haunted. It was alive, and it wanted her. As she gathered her things, ready to flee, the front door slammed shut on its own, trapping her inside. The haunting of Ashcroft Manor had begun. Evelyn knew she couldn't escape, so she turned to investigating the manor's secrets. She searched room by room, uncovering forgotten letters, cryptic diaries, and peculiar trinkets left behind by past occupants. Each discovery unraveled another thread of Ashcroft's dark history, a pattern of previous owners who had all fallen victim to the same inexplicable madness. Strange symbols carved into the wooden beams and etched into the wallpaper sent chills down her spine. She traced them with trembling fingers, feeling a strange pull, as if the house itself responded to her touch. The whispers came clearer, forming fragmented words of warning and longing. As Evelyn dug deeper, she realized she wasn't entirely alone. The housekeeper, Mrs. Thatcher, who had remained in service even after her aunt's passing, watched her with wary eyes and spoke in hushed tones. The gardener, Mr. Calloway, seemed strangely intent on avoiding the house after dark. Each had their own warnings, cryptic remarks about staying out of certain rooms and not disturbing what sleeps beneath. Evelyn pressed them for answers, but they deflected her questions with evasions and half-truths. She couldn't shake the feeling that they knew more than they were letting on. One night, Evelyn awoke to the sound of footsteps echoing through the halls. She followed them to the grand staircase, where she found the figure from the mirror standing at the bottom. This time, it didn't disappear. It spoke, a distorted version of her own voice whispering her name. Fear rooted her to the spot as the figure took a step closer and she blacked out. She woke up hours later in the library. Pages of her aunt's journal scattered around her. One page, in particular, stood out. An incantation written in frantic handwriting meant to ward off the entity within the house. But could she trust it? Evelyn devised plans to cleanse the manor, from burning sage to performing the rituals in her aunt's journal. Each attempt failed, the entity only growing stronger, manifesting more frequently, whispering things only she could hear. The feeling of possession grew heavier. She would lose time, waking up in different parts of the manor with no memory of how she got there. In desperation, Evelyn confronted Mrs. Thatcher, demanding the truth. The old housekeeper's face turned ashen as she finally admitted that Evelyn's aunt had been trying to contain the entity, not banish it. And with her aunt gone, the house was looking for someone new to claim. The realization sent Evelyn into a spiral of fear. Was it already too late? Evelyn's sense of urgency grew with each passing night. The entity's presence became more tangible, manifesting as fleeting shadows and distorted reflections that followed her every move. Sleep became elusive, and when it came, it was plagued with vivid nightmares of being consumed by the house itself. The whispers evolved into pleading voices, calling her name with increasing desperation. Driven to the brink, Evelyn fortified herself in the library, poring over the journal and the ancient texts she had uncovered. The notes spoke of rituals and symbols of protection, yet none seemed to hold the power needed to banish the entity. She tried burning sage, drawing protective symbols, and reading incantations aloud, but nothing seemed to weaken the entity's grip. The feeling of being watched grew unbearable, and Evelyn began locking her bedroom door at night, though deep down she knew it wouldn't stop whatever was inside the house. As she delved deeper, she realized that the entity was not simply a ghost. It was something much older, something that fed on the fears and vulnerabilities of those who resided within the manor. She noticed strange patterns emerging in the occurrences, cold spots appearing in the same places at the same times, strange markings appearing on the walls that hadn't been there before, and a persistent feeling that something was trying to communicate with her directly. Piecing together the fragmented knowledge she had gathered, Evelyn formulated a theory. The manor itself was a conduit, amplifying the entity's strength. The original builders had unknowingly laid its foundation over an ancient burial ground, and the house had acted as a beacon for the restless spirits trapped beneath. The whispers were not warnings. They were cries for help from those who had been consumed before her. Evelyn spent hours drawing out diagrams of the manor, marking the locations where the disturbances were strongest. Each point formed a pattern, leading her to believe that the center of the entity's power was somewhere beneath the house. She found references to an old basement in the journal, a place sealed off long ago. With renewed determination, she set out to find it. As Evelyn tested her theory, she placed protective talismans in key locations throughout the house. The results were immediate. Doors slammed shut, the temperature plummeted, and an oppressive force seemed to press in on her from all sides. The entity was resisting her efforts, and Evelyn knew she was running out of time. Each time she placed a charm, the whispers grew louder, and the shadows in the corners seemed darker, more defined. Determined to end the nightmare, Evelyn sought answers from Mrs. Thatcher and Mr. Calloway once more. This time, the fear in their eyes betrayed their knowledge. Mrs. Thatcher confessed that Evelyn's aunt had performed rituals of containment to keep the entity at bay, but the power was weakening. Mr. Calloway revealed that he had seen Evelyn's aunt speaking to the shadows, bargaining with the darkness in whispers that he could never understand. Realizing she was closer to the truth than ever, Evelyn pressed them further. Mrs. Thatcher reluctantly admitted that there had been others, tenants, servants, who had vanished without explanation over the decades. The manor had a hunger, one that Evelyn's aunt had tried to satisfy in secret, feeding it with offerings in the hopes of keeping the darkness contained. Evelyn realized that the only way to end the haunting was to face the entity head on. With the house growing more aggressive, she prepared for the final confrontation, armed with the knowledge she had gleaned and the fading hope that she could break the cycle. As she descended into the manor's forgotten basement, the air thick with rot and whispers, Evelyn knew that her greatest battle was about to begin. The wooden steps groaned underfoot as she moved deeper into the darkness, lantern flickering in her trembling hand. Symbols carved into the stone walls pulsed faintly, and a deep, rhythmic sound echoed in the cavernous space beyond. Something was waiting for her. Evelyn's descent into the basement felt like stepping into another world, one where time had no meaning, and the air grew thicker with every breath. The rhythmic sound echoed louder, a heartbeat that seemed to pulse from the walls themselves. Her lantern flickered, casting fleeting glimpses of grotesque symbols carved deep into the stone. Shadows slithered in the corners, whispering her name in voices that no longer sounded human. As Evelyn moved deeper, the entity revealed itself in full force. The air turned ice cold, and she felt something wrapping around her mind. Memories that weren't hers, voices that pleaded for release. Her knees buckled as an overwhelming despair gripped her, whispering doubts and fears she had long buried. The manor wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and it wanted her to surrender. In the center of the basement stood an ancient altar, covered in layers of dust and dried remnants of past sacrifices. At its heart, a figure emerged, an amorphous mass of darkness with glowing hollow eyes that bore into her soul. Evelyn realized that it had been feeding on the house's occupants for centuries, drawing power from their fears and despair. The entity's voice echoed in her mind, offering relief, power, and a place among its victims. Evelyn gritted her teeth, gripping the talisman she had prepared. She began chanting the incantation she had found in her aunt's journal, her voice trembling but growing stronger with each word. The entity lashed out, filling the room with deafening wails and violent gusts of wind that extinguished her lantern. In the darkness, Evelyn pressed forward, clutching the talisman to her chest, her voice unwavering. The walls trembled, and the shadows recoiled, writhing in agony, as the ancient symbols in the basement glowed with newfound intensity. With a final, resolute chant, Evelyn thrust the talisman onto the altar. A blinding light erupted from its center, piercing the darkness and sending the entity into a violent, shrieking frenzy. The house groaned in protest as the force tethering the entity to the manor snapped. The oppressive weight lifted from Evelyn's mind, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of clarity. The whispers faded into silence, and the shadows dissipated into nothingness. The manor, once suffocating and malevolent, now stood eerily still. Evelyn stumbled back up the stairs, emerging into the cold night air, gasping as the first rays of dawn broke through the trees. Mrs. Thatcher and Mr. Calloway stood outside, their expressions a mix of relief and guilt. "It's over," Evelyn whispered, but she knew deep down that the scars left by the manor would linger forever. With Ashcroft Manor now silent, Evelyn made her choice. She gathered her belongings, leaving the house behind, knowing it would no longer haunt anyone else. But as she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her, lurking in the shadows just beyond, on the trees. The haunting of Ashcroft Manor had ended, or so she hoped.